Property Unfiltered. Real investors, real stories, the good and the bad in property investing.
Well, good day, everyone. It's Liam Garman here, Managing Editor of Real Estate here at Momentum Media, the team that brings you the Property Unfiltered podcast with my co-host, as always, Simon Loo. Simon, back in the podcast studio again.
I am, yes. It's been, I think, a couple of months since I've been here. Yeah, it's just life and random stuff happening.
I know, it's always popping up. We had a fantastic few guests here 2 months ago, of course. Emergency services personnel. We'll put a link to that back in the show notes because I think a lot of Australians would be really keen to learn more about their journey and their story, but how House Finder helped them craft their property journey, get them on the property ladder, despite quite demanding jobs and quite everyday jobs. It was quite inspirational. But Simon, we've got 2 more amazing guests in the studio today. Do you want to introduce them?
I want to keep this theme going because I think it's always interesting to get people from various backgrounds and how they've succeeded or are on their way to succeeding in property. And today I've got Lawrence, who has been with us for just around 3 years now. And in that time, he's actually bought 9 properties. 9 properties. And this is post-COVID, during a time when all the buyer's agents and all these people, experts are out there saying it can't be done. You know, the lending landscape and all this kind of stuff. And you can't buy a house and leverage and buy a house and leverage and keep going, right? So another guest I've got today is Mr. Hung Chuy, who is the head of Strategic Brokers. I've actually had Hung here before. I think it was the second show that I did, and he talked about his journey and how he became a broker and how he built his property portfolio and so on. But Hung's been very instrumental in helping Lawrence build his portfolio as well during the last 3 or so years. And I think it's really important to maybe educate our viewers or listeners as to how it still can be done. You know what I mean?
I think there's going to be a lot of hard questions. And actually, I'm going to throw this out to our listeners now because I think 9 properties is a mammoth task, and we're going to be going on your strategy as to how the 3 of you did that together, actually. But the finance, Hung, there's going to be a lot of massive questions. For any of our listeners that are listening to this and this podcast sparks any questions, send them through to myself, liam.garman@momentummedia.com.au, and we might actually do some articles following up on it if you have any big questions from our experts here and you want to learn more.
100%.
And of course, reach out to House Finder as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you know, like how do we even meet?
I introduced Lawrence to Simon. Lawrence is actually, I guess, the brother-in-law of now one of my brokers, funny enough here. And, you know, I don't know whether we met at the Bucks party or we met at
the wedding.
At the wedding, but we met at one of these family affairs. And I don't think we really clicked on until, obviously, at some point he needed a broker to review some of his interest rates.
Yeah.
So we had a little look at his portfolio and see what he could do. And he's like, oh, look, I want to buy another property. So this triggered a conversation. And, you know, the borrowing capacity was quite limited. He would get one property, it was probably I think it was 550 or something like that. He's like, oh, what the hell am I going to buy for 550? You know, so that's kind of where the conversation triggered, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, mate, you can get plenty for 550. And we're going back 3 years ago.
Yeah.
You can still find stuff at 550, obviously, but, you know, 3 years ago, there was some good quality assets out there at 550. And that's where I then obviously introduced you to Simon, because Simon was buying at that 550 level.
Yeah.
And then the 2 of you guys connected. And obviously, Lawrence, you had a few properties at the time.
Yep.
Yes. I had 3 units in Southwest Sydney. And that's actually one of the reasons why I reached out as well, because at that time, I think interest rates were like close to nothing.
Yeah.
And we had 3 units, Cabramatta, Liverpool, and like Candy Vale. And they were returning maybe $300 a week.
Yeah.
Which at 0% interest rate or 2% was fine to hold.
Yeah.
But they weren't actually making any money. So after a while, I got frustrated and I'm like, hey, or Nadi, how do I make some money?
Yeah.
I need to make some money, man.
I think the conversation flowed from there because then, you know, Lawrence was he was like a dog with a bone. He knew that property makes money, right? And he didn't know how. You know, and like anyone who listens to these shows, they're trying to find out how, right? That's the whole point of listening to this podcast, because you want to get the secrets that will give you the secret sauce, whatever you call it, to, you know, give you the mindset or whatever it is that you need to push you to that next level. And I think, like all of us, at some point, he was very lost on, you know, I bought all of these properties, and, you know, from what I know, they should just automatically make money, right? But you were experiencing it firsthand that it wasn't the case. It was all nice that it was giving you some rental at 0% interest rates, whatever we were at the time. You were 2%, 2.25, whatever it was. But there was no capital growth. The properties they were going backwards.
So they actually lost value over that time.
They did, yeah. I think you
Yes.
sold for a loss on some of them, yeah.
One of the units I had to sell for, I think, a $48,000 loss.
That's substantial.
Wow.
Yes, yes.
And to hold it for years and years and
Yeah.
years.
How long was it?
I think it was probably like 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years.
Wow.
So that's funny because a lot of the logic that people come in with, where they say if you hold a property for 8 to 10 years, it's going to double in value. But if you're in an area where you do have oversupply, or if you're in the wrong asset class, that actually just doesn't exist.
Yeah, and if you buy we talk about buying under market and bargains and all this kind of stuff, but there's just so many pitfalls out there, particularly in like big cities, like Sydney in particular. All these developers and builders and people just pulling on the heartstrings, of people when they look at property, and I think that's where it gets a lot of people, falling into a trap. So it's definitely not a good thing.
I think my personal view of how that became for Lawrence was the fact that his parents had bought these style properties throughout their time, and like your parents, they care for you the most out of anyone, right? So they want you to succeed. So they're going to push you into the same way that it worked for them.
Yeah.
But what worked for them doesn't necessarily work for you. The environment is changing. Everything's changing. So from where stock is, what time in the market, what's good value, everything's different to what it was back then, right? Those areas, if you had bought back then, yeah, mate, would anyone live in Cabramatta when the syringes were everywhere? That's where we grew up, right? So that's where, like,
I remember
back
that.
then, you could buy a house, even going back in 2012, in Cabramatta for under 350 grand, right?
Yeah.
Those are $1.something million today. But
Yeah.
is it going to still get that same trajectory over the next 5-10 years? What's going to give you some growth short term? Your parents are pushing in the right direction because they felt that's the right path, but the world's changed, and obviously adapting to it's really important.
So I understand that when Lawrence, you were looking for another property, you were kind of up against that wall. That you two had some pretty frank discussions about selling the properties at a loss, which obviously for a lot of people is a very emotionally hard thing to do because you want to sit there until you're making money. But if you got a lot of this equity that's not really doing anything, you had to look down that alley. Talk us through that decision-making process.
Or maybe I'll start first and I'll wind it back into you because I recall a conversation started with, after the introduction to Simon, what happened was obviously Simon found him his first property. And as Simon does, he bought, off-market, undervalued. And within, I believe it was 6 months or so, that property had gained probably close to 100 grand in equity and very, very fast, which, was absolutely amazing. He's outperformed his other 3 properties within the first few months of buying the property, right?
Yes.
So that was the trigger, right? I believe that was personally was the trigger. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, for sure. It was good to see that I was actually making money rather than going and maybe I'll make $10,000 holding 3 properties in the last 6 months. But
Yeah, it's always
just having, hey, we've actually made money.
This guy's calling me up. He's like, man, it's gone up 2% per month on RP data. Literally every single day, like, another 2%. Every time the 1st of January, 1st of February, he's like, another 2%.
because I see like a stock on the
2 Feb,
charts, like see a crypto going up.
Yeah, because it's not something that I was used to at the time.
It's not a normal environment to see 2% per month, but like these things were happening during that time, right? But, and it had continued to happen for sure.
Yep,
Yeah, and
so-
I think it's like, I mean, that's always a tell, right? Like a lot of people don't believe, and rightly so, buying a house, pulling out 100 odd K equity within months. It's one of those sort of too good to be true kind of things. But I think once you see it in real time and you actually, go back, do the revalue and have the money sitting in your account, you go, oh, wow, I can use this money for anything really. But then you kept going, you kept buying more
This is
properties.
real.
Well, then what happened after that? So this is after obviously getting the first property with you, Simon, Lawrence, he could see how it all worked, right? I believe that you started listening to podcasts, you started reading, you started doing everything, right? So you were educating yourself. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Podcasts like this. Basically, I didn't know anything at the time. I just followed. Hey, my parents did this. They've done pretty well. Property can't go wrong, right? So I'll just buy whatever was convenient, and then just put the money in, and hopefully in 8 years' time, 10 years' time, I might make some money.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it didn't go that way.
Yeah.
So talk to us through the decision to sell and how you got to that point.
Yeah. I think on that point was with that first property growing, then Lawrence called me.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do I buy another one? I'm like, you're tapped out. Can't borrow any more money. Yeah.
So from there, it was basically, okay, well, it's an easy decision. Well, we can wait another 5-10 years. Maybe the unit will grow up by 10%, 50 grand, maybe. Or just sell the property off, take that loss and move on.
Yeah. So what, I guess how the conversation flowed out was like, well, how do I get more, right? And I was like, well, your options are you've got to get a lot more income, which isn't an immediate feasible thing to obviously get more borrowing power. Equity position starting to run thin, or you might sell off a couple of these units to bring back borrowing power. Also, then fund deposits for the next purchase. And obviously, Lawrence was doing his own research, and for him, I was actually surprised at his response because he comes back, he goes, "Fuck it, sell it all."
Yeah.
No choice.
Yeah.
I was like, all right, if that's what you want to do. But then leading beyond that was like, he's like, I need to get to 10 properties. I need to get to 20 properties. I need to get to an amount that's going to allow me to replace my income, and become financially free. The conversation got, he got, as he got more educated through the process, he became more and more entailed to want to go and, hey, let's hit this hard,
So with some of your other clients, who I'm going to guess that is something that you would sometimes advise them, but they're emotionally connected. They don't want to divorce themselves from, maybe it's a family home, or maybe it's something that they're that's banking on it maybe one day working out because they're too emotionally attached.
Yeah, so I'd never advise someone to sell because obviously that's not my role, right?
Yeah.
But what I do give them is the financial options. They told me they want to buy 2 more of these Simon Loo properties. I go, great. That's going to be, maybe 700 grand max per property. The only way to do this is potentially you could sell this or maneuver this, or we go second tier funding lines. Here's your interest rate. Can you swallow another 1%? Maybe there's not enough borrowing power. So now we need to go to a third tier funding line. This is an extra 2%. Do you want to swallow that? And reality is an extra 1% on $1 million, right? Is an extra 10 grand a year. If you're outpacing that, if you can put the logic together, then you're kind of flipping a coin. But at the same time, when you're buying, there's guys out there buying super negatively geared property, and people are counting their beans on 1%. When you can outperform $10,000 a year quite easily, right? Depending on how you look at it, and then eventually refinance it out is the idea. It's not a long-term plan to hold that shitty lender. You might have an exit strategy that you want to sell in a different market. But long-winded answer.
Yeah, well, you give people the options, and then they select which one works for them.
And then they might be like Lawrence and just say, fuck it, sell it all.
And then just exit the position, which I can imagine is pretty rare. But, the benefit is in the hindsight, because now you've scaled to 9. So I think everyone who's listening to this is going to want to know the journey to 9. So the first one we've already bought with Simon, and that's in Queensland.
Queensland, yeah. And then every single property after that was in Perth, in WA. I think it's worth noting as well that none of these properties are in your random whoop regional areas that's been spruiked to death, especially in the past few years. They're very high growth, and I think the equity position is evident now. It's almost $1.3 million worth of equity across the 9 properties. So $1.3 million worth of equity across 9 properties in major capital city areas, is definitely no easy task.
And there's room to grow still.
Yeah, and there's still room to grow.
Still room to grow.
I'll probably note on that as well. That 1.3 figure is purely the growth from inception.
Yeah.
Right? Not even money that was put in. That's the amount of growth that went in on those 9 properties over the last 3 years, which is, I think it's an amazing result.
Yeah, actually, for our listeners at home, we do have a very useful printout. I'm sorry, Lawrence, because I think we've all got a very deep insight into your portfolio at the moment. But yeah, that 1.3 mil is growth. So if you put down a deposit, that's not even including the deposit. So How did you, and I'll leave this to the three of you to talk about the strategy. What strategy did you do to get to 9? Because I think a lot of people who might be starting their property investment journey right now, they're going to be gawking at that figure, and there's got to be more to it than just we kept buying houses.
Yeah.
Well, that's really what we did, right? I think the first 2 or 3 were under the personal name, and all I wanted to do was just keep buying houses. But then, as Hung said before, we got to a point where, hey, you couldn't get me more money. So then we had to go through different options, and that left the
I think we had to plan it out a little bit. So, I think the beginning of the journey was we're going to get rid of the units, right? He had one good property in the 4 that he had, right? So before we started the journey. So we got rid of the 3 units, opened up the borrowing power back, got it in individual names.
And you kept your good property?
He kept it at the time.
At the time?
Correct.
At
At the time.
Okay, yep.
And then obviously as you secured, property 2, 3, 4, and all of those were, it's 2% per month across 4 of them now.
You're getting calls every day now. Yeah.
Mate, we're excited. We're having a good time through this whole journey too, to be fair. Like Lawrence and I had, it's actually, this is what makes my job the most joyous when we see these results. And, and we've been part of the journey from day one. It actually brings us a lot of joy. And makes us tick for sure. So the first 4 were like that. And then it's like, well, we got to number 4. It's like, well, now how do we get to 5, 6, 7? And I'm like, there's a few options. We'll go second tier funding.
So basically at this point, you're looking at getting him another mortgage. Banks are like, nada. No.
We're pretty much almost tapped out. Yeah. Or we were tapped out, to be fair. We had to go, we could get more finance, but it was going to be up to 3rd-tier lenders.
That's when you're really banking on it. So then what was your movements from there?
So I think as this was happening, Lawrence became more and more ambitious about how big this portfolio was. I don't fully share how, all the options to get that ambitious until we have a real big game plan. And then when I feel like your mindset has to be ready for that. You have to be financially educated. You've done all your research. You know what you're in for. You understand accounting, you understand taxation, you understand, your structures, who you're using as your part of your team and how you're going to build that out. So I think that piece of the puzzle is really important to understand. Lawrence's mindset was ready. And then at that point, then Lawrence and I sat down and go, well, how do we do this? What do we do? I'm like, look, we've got to start using structures. There is a possibility, and then he came to me and said he's going to sell the one good asset he had. And then use that to, I guess, all the proceeds from that to leverage into, building them out in trusts, getting these trusts to a level where the trusts were self-sustaining, and then moving on and trying to continue building that portfolio. Without taking that major leap or that major step, we'd still be stuck, or we'll be stuck with, a whole bunch of 3rd-tier lenders at the moment.
So talk to us through that. Making a trust self-sustaining, you made it sound so easy, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, so I think the process, it depends on, everyone's situation is different. It's obviously not financial advice. And there's a lot of talk around the scene about these trusts, how people think it's unlimited borrowing power. It's not. The fact that it's that trust, it needs to be self-sufficient. It needs to cover all its costs. It needs to cover, your accounting fees, all your property expenses, rent comes in, there's interest coverage. And if that trust is $1 profitable after that, then there are certain funders who will accept that and no longer look at that as a liability. So it's almost quarantined in its own world. Not all funders will accept that. There's only a very limited amount of funders who will look at that as such. But, obviously don't make that your Bible, because they are constantly reviewing and looking at how they deem these things profitable. And there's a lot of talk about that potentially changing to have to produce accounting prepared financials and other sorts of methods. But, taking that game plan in place from day dot, it's really critical to being able to build out this portfolio.
So,
I think it's there's so much rhetoric at the moment about trusts and unlimited borrowing, and it's a lot more complex than that. And also you have to time it right? If you start off buying properties in the wrong structures, you can stuff that up. Or if you buy the wrong asset in that structure, you can stuff that up, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to get positive cash flow or even neutral cash flow in this environment. So, one of the ways we try and counteract that is by focusing on areas where we know the rent's going to grow pretty rapidly. So usually by one renewal, your first lease renewal, you might be increasing the rent $50, $100 a week. And what used to be negative cash flow suddenly becomes neutral, even slightly positive. And now we're in an environment where rates are starting to drop as well. So that can definitely add to the cash flow mix. But how important is cash flow in sort of continuing this sort of journey?
Yeah, so you obviously need to get it cash flow positive for these trusts to obviously quarantine themselves as such. So there's a few different methods in my eyes. So, people don't like to sell, but you could sell.
Yeah.
Reduce debt, for instance. You could take a lower LVR with a good rate, take a lower mortgage, which obviously will determine it to be positive. You could buy a site that has the ability to build a granny flat, for instance. Things like that. You could obviously renovate or even subdivide, split. There's so many different ways to do it, right? In Lawrence's specific case, we were buying obviously properties in WA where there was multiple things happening there.
Yeah.
We were buying obviously undervalued, so the mortgages were smaller. We were buying properties which were in great areas with heaps of rental growth and demand.
Yeah.
Like some of his yields exploded over time, and then Lawrence and I we kind of maneuvered on how much loans we were taking against each property after the sale of that of one of his core assets. So then we knew exactly what loan we needed to get these loans to pretty much a positive territory.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at some of these numbers, 430,000 purchase price, 620 a week rental, 320,000 purchase price, 520 a week rental. Like these yields are, I mean, even in today's numbers, they'd be pretty neutral / positive, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's something that was important to us to make sure that we could actually hold on to the property. And so one of the things that we always look at when the deals come through is, hey, how much do I need to put in after all of the expenses and factoring into if there's any depreciation? How much do we need to put in to actually hold on to this property?
Yeah,
to keep going.
Yeah, and this is why we always focus on a very similar property. Like all these houses, they're all different, right? Different suburbs, different types of properties, but they're typically always houses or standalone properties. Older, newer doesn't really matter because we've got a mixture of older houses, newer houses, 3 beds, 4 beds, larger blocks, smaller blocks. A lot of people get too analytical when it comes to, I only want 4 beds, I only want this and that. And then that's when they start to get into that sort of emotional space that leads people to make the wrong decisions, right? And then they don't make money on their properties. But, just making sure, because all these areas, they back then and even still now, they were up and coming, right? So there used to be, your lower socio / working class, quote unquote, kind of areas where it's just suddenly getting like a massive infiltration of owner occupiers, like a new demographic. And that's when you got the demand, not only from a buying and selling perspective, but from a renting perspective as well. And that's what pushes these rents progressively up. Not only because of demand, but also as the area improves to become a new owner-occupier area. So I think selecting these areas is super, super important in a major capital cities. And it's always the areas that you least suspect, because I remember, even sending some of these properties to you and some of the ones that we didn't end up going with, there was a lot of questions around, are you sure, Simon? Are you sure? This doesn't seem right. Yeah. But it's not a case of trust us, we know what we're doing, but it's more just you can kind of see the patterns. Similar to Cabramatta,
the syringes everywhere.
Yeah. Those syringes are buried deep now somewhere. Yeah. But you can see the transition almost in real time because, I think a lot of it has to do with affordability. When people can't afford what used to be affordable, they obviously always go to the next best thing. And as gentrification or the urban sprawl keeps spreading, that's when you want to expose yourself, because that's when you get, massive amounts of not only capital gains, but also rental growth. So I think targeting those was a very crucial thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very fine line between somewhere being lower socioeconomic one day and then just really cool and trendy the next.
Yeah.
I mean, how many inner city areas have gone from that in the space of
so
few
many?
years?
I mean, in Sydney, Marrickville,
Erskineville, areas like that, and that's where you look at that data.
Yeah.
So what you were saying, Hung, before is really interesting. So you've got those, not a checklist, but you've got those options at hand to silo your structures to make sure that they're not going to be maybe an economic burden is a good way of putting it, and ruining further borrowing. Simon and Lawrence, I think one big thing that a lot of listeners will be thinking is, well, 9 properties, that alone would be massive when it comes to deposits, when it comes to stamp duty, because it all adds up. How did you go about doing that? Were you leveraging equity from previous houses? How did you go about continuously kind of refilling that cup for deposits?
I think
Anyone can take it.
I think every time we bought a property, you had equity to pull out, pretty much, except for maybe the last few. Would that be correct to say? Or
When did we pull out the equity?
There was a combination of things. Yeah. So I think I'm the one who was at the forefront of all this.
Yeah. That's why you're here.
I think I just,
You get the hard questions.
I just walked past and they invited me on. I think it was a matter of a combination of things. Obviously, we didn't draw any equity out of the trust loans because we didn't want to use that to affect the positive cash flow of them. We looked at taking equity out of the ones in the individual names, which were, obviously the earlier adopters.
Well, because you get the negative gearing benefits when it's in your own name versus if it's in a structure. Yeah.
Well, we can't claim the equity out, but obviously, taking it out of there, his borrowing capacity permitted it at the time. And obviously, Lawrence did sell a larger ticket item, which allowed, him to have a deposit ready to then keep continuing on these structures. But not everyone's going to be willing to sell that, right? So
Yes. It was my wife's first property, the one that we were actually living in. So
Your PPOR.
Yeah. So we actually made the decision to sell our house, our home, in order to move forward.
Well, that's
it's a
pretty
decision.
brave,
It's definitely not a light decision. But I do find there comes a crossroad, right, where you kind of have to, otherwise you can't keep going. Selling the house that you live in is obviously a very, very personal thing. A lot of people, there's always two sides to the coin as well. Your partner and if you have kids and everything as well. But I think a lot of people, especially when you get to that point, you kind of look at the performance and what you've done so far. And then the decision's made a lot easier if you can see results, and if you've experienced it. And then you can see the goal. Okay, if I keep going, if I keep buying 4 or 5 more, or 10 more, I'm going to get that passive income because, 3 years on and this kind of equity level, I mean, technically you could consolidate your debt and have 3 odd properties just fully offset or fully paid off. And that'll get a couple of $1,000s a week.
But that's not what you want to do.
With a passive income already. Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so what's the next steps?
Well, we want to get to 20. We have it's a little bit silly, but we have this progress board with a whole bunch of holes drilled through it. And every time we purchase a property, we chuck, those little gibbets that you put on your Crocs, the shoe charms. We chuck one of those in, and we need to fill that board, man.
Yeah.
We need to fill that board. So that's one of the things that.
The first time I went over to his house, he showed me the board, and I think it was we were 2 properties deep.
Yeah, probably 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And with the 20 already, with already spaces there for the 20?
Yeah. And every time we buy a house, he sends me a picture of the next one, the next gibbet.
So what are the gibbets? Like, are they like? I know, like where people put like, I don't know, like a beer or something on.
No, they're just random ones.
Just random ones,
like Pokemon or something, right?
But I think that's good as well. Like, just in your own way, you have your own sort of vision board, I guess. You keep track of it, and you've got the end goal, and that's part of the process of keeping going as well. Because like I say in all these shows, it's owning and buying lots of properties. The buying part is actually easy.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
You have a bit of money, you put the deposit down, sign a few pieces of paper, you got a property. But managing, owning them, the tenants, the maintenance, the uncertainty of things happening around you, people telling you, people that you love telling you, oh, you should do this instead, you're doing the wrong thing. Like, that's the hardest thing. So it's really important just to keep your eye on the why or the drive, and that's what really keeps you going. But have you had any sort of any sort of war stories about these properties so far?
Nothing crazy, you might put in a aircon unit or, replace your hot water tank.
Yeah.
Nothing too crazy, I don't think. I think the difficult part is, the finance side actually. Yeah, once we get the finances, like, it's pretty smooth sailing.
Thank God.
It's an ongoing battle for me.
Yeah.
My associate Nora, who works beside me, she's like, "Oh, Lawrence again!" Like that
third time this
Jackie
month.
Chan face. He's like, "Oh, again!"
Yes.
And as it gets bigger, so you can imagine us, right? We have to update the spreadsheet, and now software, you got to update all of the details, and every time, then you've got to be so accurate with every single calculation. So when you 1 or 2 properties is easy,
Yeah.
3 or 4, it's still kind of easy.
Yeah.
You get to 6 or 7, it's like, oh.
Yeah.
8, 9 is like, was that one? Like, if you look
Yeah.
at this, he's got like 1, 2 in the same suburb, so it confuses the hell out of her.
Yeah.
You know, so
I can definitely see it, like Simon, your point of view with the challenge. It's like an ongoing motivation, right? Now, I understand, you can't name names, but I can only assume that you would have had a lot of clients come and go that had that 20 portfolio goal that after 4 or 5, it got too hard, or they got railroaded, or they're like, oh, I've got really cool equity now. Now I can get that PPOR that I
Yeah.
wanted. And then they're kind of back to their 9 to 5, but in a slightly better PPOR.
It's actually 3 or 4
Yeah.
out of the thousands of people we worked with. And
Only
around
3 or
3 or
4?
4, that's when they tend to stop.
Oh, at 3 or 4 properties.
Yeah, 3 or 4
yeah.
properties.
I thought you meant 3 or
I've
4
noticed that
people.
too,
yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay.
I think at 3 or 4 is when I think, even if you see, like, this is what, like, it sounds really wishy-washy, Instagrammy, motivational stuff, right? But, the reason why people want to invest in property is obviously to make money. But I think it's really important to find out, or to know why you want to make money. For a lot of people is to quit work or work less or start a business or, dedicate their lives to not-for-profit or whatever.
Yeah, because we were talking about that a few weeks ago where you
Yeah.
said you've actually got a lot of people that are very well-intentioned people that they want to work for charities and stuff, which is why they're like, oh, I've got this goal of a passive income so I can actually dedicate my life to helping other people, which is quite cool.
100%. And that's actually what gets you through the pain. Because this is a slow burn, right? I know we've done 9 properties in 3 years and so on, but it's almost boring after a while. You buy a house, pull equity, buy a house, pull equity. And, you always hear of someone that's done something where they've got like a much bigger return or, 20% yields or whatever. And then that's when people get sidetracked. But I think it also comes down to financing, because after 3 or 4, I think that's when most people earning an average income, maybe times 2 in a household, starts to hit those walls where to get that extra loan, they have to do something a little bit uncomfortable. Whether it is sell some underperforming properties or maybe even properties that have performed well, or maybe find a way to get a high income, or something that would kind of derail their life temporarily. And I think, for people to be able to take that step and keep going is, comes down to a lot more than just making purely, I want to make a little bit more money. Do you know what I mean? It's not an easy thing to do at the end of the day.
So what are your whys?
Oh, my wise. Oh, mate, you just threw me under the bus.
Yeah, I know. You've got like
Jesus
10
Christ.
seconds to think of something very deep.
No, you know what's funny? It's actually, I just had this conversation 2-3 hours ago with one of my old clients, and he's like, I guess he follows me on social, and we've been friends over the journey. It's been 10 years since I've helped him buy a few properties, and I've watched him come from zero, from the first parental guarantee I did for him with $0 in his pocket to now he's probably net 10 mil or something like that now. So having this conversation is like, oh, what's your why? And I'm like, I didn't actually have to hesitate, because I actually realized, at this point in my life, I have clear financial freedom. If I didn't want to work another day in my life, I don't have to. But my why is part of the family or the community, the people that I help. In my business, I have my whole family working in the business now, because I truly believe in what we do. So, and I really want to raise them up and look after my people. So that's my biggest why. Obviously, my family, my children. So all
You
those
got
reasons.
quite an interesting background as well, coming as a refugee.
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone's tuning into this, maybe go back to episode 2 or something like that, and we tell them all about the pirate ship and stuff like that. Then my dad came
crazy.
on and crashed and stuck on an island, kind of like Castaway.
Yeah.
It's actually a horrific story, but listen back to that. That kind of tells you where
You'll put
it
a
all
link in the
started.
show notes
Yeah.
for people to click back. And Lawrence, what's your why?
I think in this day and age, man, everything is so loud. Everything is so crazy. So many things going on. So part of, doing this is having options to, okay, well, we don't want to live in Sydney anymore, or we want to move somewhere else. We're having options on the table and taking finances off the table. And also to spend more time with my daughter. She's turned 2 a few months ago now, and man, I don't know where the bloody time's gone. It's gone so quick. So just being more present with the family is probably the biggest why now.
Yeah. There we go. I mean, it's a very common one. You know, I mean, I've got young kids, and my goal is now to spend as much time with them as possible. You know, between the hours of 6 and 8, I'm usually non-contactable to the frustration of some of my clients, but it is what it is, you know. So
it's kind of like what we used to do when we first started our businesses. I assume Simon was the same. Mate, we'd be available 24/7.
Yeah.
Your old
Always.
clients are like, oh yeah, I used to call them at 9 o'clock. No worries.
Yeah.
Sorry, man. It's just not the way it rolls anymore.
Yeah, 100%.
Unfortunately.
You know,
Yeah.
interesting that I still do a lot of calls at 9 because that's when the kids go to sleep, and then I can be a hustler
You're
again.
very active at night time. It's really like everything's always coming through at that time.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people work.
Yeah.
What can we do? You know, that's just the way the industry is. You know, so nighttime is the time when a lot of when I have time to talk to a lot of people. But there's perks. You know, sometimes during the day I don't have to do. I can spend more time with kids and all that kind of stuff. So it's not all tears.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, we're all crying for you, Simon. Look, it's been a pretty inspirational podcast. 9 properties. Simon, you did say that a lot of your clients do get stuck at that 3-4 mark.
Yeah.
For people that might be stuck at that mark and they actually just literally do not know what to do, it's something that we've spoken about this on this podcast a few times. There's a lot of accidental investors. You know, you might have had a PPOR and then one investment property, and then through inheritance you've picked up another one, and you don't really know what to do from there. What would you say to people that might be stuck at that mark and not really know where to go from here?
We'll just find out once again, you know, really sort of think why you're doing this, right? If the reason that you're stuck is because I don't feel like moving forward, then you need to determine the real reason why you want to keep going. If the reason why you're stuck is I can't get more finance, talk to a good broker. You know, find out what your options are, find out what you need to do, whether it's with the stuff you have at the moment, you know, to sell or to change the structure or refinance or whatever to enable you to borrow for another property or another 2 properties or whatever, then do that. You know, and then I think maybe from those 2, determine the type of properties you need to buy moving forward, because in my world there is a lot of noise as well. You know, in the world of property, there's so many things you can do, and there's also a lot of people trying to sell an agenda. So people who don't have that direction or have that motivation tend to you know, go down certain paths that, oh, this is a great thing to do, maybe you should do it, and then they do it, and then it, you know, 10 years later it may end in tears or something like that. So you know, having that why and then your strategy, and then figure out how to finance it, and then just stay on that path. You know, these houses one after another is not by accident. You know, the reason why we've bought properties, they're all very similar, you know, fundamentally. And these are the ones that get you to passive income, if that's your goal. If your goal is 100K passive income, then, you know, buy a bunch of these, sell off a few, pay off a few, and that's it. So, yeah, just kind of really sort of dig deep and figure out the reason, you know, why you really want to keep buying properties.
I think my favorite part of looking at the finances of these 9 in front of me, because Simon came very prepared, is the Horse Head bought on 10 April and the Balladura bought on 22 April, at less than 2 weeks apart. I don't know how you guys manage that.
That's the magic of the broker.
Yeah. Man, he must be really calling you out of hours. I'm sorry.
He's always calling me, but do I answer his phone all the time? No.
It screens the call.
Just don't call on Monday.
Do
Call at 9
not call
a.m.
me on Monday. That is the worst day to ever call.
Well, is
call
that
me.
Lawrence's day?
No, that's like that's Lawrence's day. The whole weekend, you get everyone that was thinking to do something over the weekend.
That's when they've
all attack you on Monday, right?
Yep.
And you get, like, I've been doing this for 15 years, so you guys, since the rate drop, actually, wild. I'm getting clients from 10 years ago, just randomly, randomly
too.
calling.
They're coming in that
Yeah.
quick.
It is my phone. I took like 50. I was telling these guys I was walking in today. I was like, man, I took like 50 calls today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially like the guys who I guess backed me in the sense that they use my services when I didn't really have this full operation. I'm always there. I've always got their back. They're gonna call me. I'm gonna pick it up. I'm gonna return their call 100% because they were there when I didn't have everything that I have now, right?
Yeah.
That's why I took 50 calls today.
That is insane in terms of how quickly it's picked up, because I think the economic finance rule of thumb is it takes 6 months for it to wash through, but it seems like it's happened within 2 weeks.
Oh, it takes time to wash through because you got to do the work.
Yeah.
You got to
Well,
do the
that's-
prep, and then you got to get the pre-approval.
Yeah.
Buy the
think
property, settle
We're
the
at the
property.
forefront, so we're at the ground.
You're actually at the starting
Yeah, I'm
point.
at the starting
Yeah.
point. At the front line, and everyone knows the same thing. So what I've commonly been seeing the last few weeks is a lot of bridging. I've been talking about so much bridging loans. There's so many people, they're trying to almost, I guess the writing's on the wall. Rates are going to drop for sure. We have, a massive undersupply of housing.
Yeah.
So everyone's just thinking the same thing. If I'm going to upgrade, now's the time. I'll
Yeah.
upgrade, but I'll sell my place later.
Yeah.
It's almost like, because we know rates are dropping, I can buy cheap and then sell high is what I've been seeing anyway, or the mindset of people that are coming to me.
And I think it's been on the cards for so long. I think for the past 12 months, all I've been hearing is, the rate's going to drop, rate's going to drop, rate's going to drop. So people are kind of maybe preparing themselves for when it happens. So when it does happen, they're like, cool, I'm going in now. So I think the first rate drop, it wasn't that crazy.
Yeah.
Because we also have this cost of living thing. So people were just like, oh, cool, rates dropped. I can finally afford groceries and fuel and all this kind of stuff now. But then when the second time it happens, we've noticed a massive pickup as well.
I looked at the core logic numbers this morning and it was every single city went up last month.
Yeah.
Yeah. There wasn't a single city that missed it. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, people are coming on board. It's a good time to do it. Look, gents, Lawrence Khuu, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having us.
And Simon, good to see you in the studio as always. We'll be back next month.
We will be. Great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for coming.
Awesome. That is all we have time for today on Property Unfiltered with Simon Loo, founder of House Finder. It's Liam Garman here, and we'll be back at the same time with another episode next month. But until then, bye-bye.